Collinsville, Tennessee, was one of those small towns where time seemed to have stopped somewhere in the 1950s. Narrow streets lined with weathered wooden houses, a rickety old church with peeling paint on its steeple, and a single gas station that still had a hand-painted sign. Everything here breathed history. The folks lived simply. They went to work, sipped coffee at Marge's Diner, and gathered every Sunday for sermons at the Baptist church. Everyone knew everyone else, and each person had their place. But among these quiet souls was one who stood out, even if she didn't shout it from the rooftops. Alana Merriweather. Alana was 32 years old, but her face carried the mark of a life that hadn't always been kind. Tall, with a proudly straight back, she had dark skin that gleamed in the sunlight and deep brown eyes that seemed to hold endless depths. Her hands were rough from hard work, but her fingers were slender and precise, as if meant for something greater than gripping a mop. Around her neck, she always wore a tiny gold cross, no bigger than a fingernail, but so precious to her. It was a gift from her grandmother, Ruth, who'd raised her after Alana's mother passed away from cancer when she was just 5. That cross wasn't just jewelry, it was her anchor, a reminder of the faith that had carried her through the darkest days. Growing up in Collinsville hadn't been easy for Alana. She was the only child of a single mother, and after her mom's death, it was just her and Grandma Ruth in a tiny house with a leaky roof and a porch that creaked with every step. Money was tight, so tight that some winters they'd heat the place with nothing but a wood stove and a prayer. But Ruth was a woman of steel, a churchgoer who'd seen her share of hardship and taught Alana that strength came from within. "Hold your head high, child," she'd say, her voice raspy but firm. "The world don't owe you nothing, but you owe it to yourself to keep going." And Alana did. By day, Alana worked as a janitor at the Collinsville Public Library, a squat brick building that smelled of old paper and dust. She'd sweep the floors, wipe down the tables, and listen to the crackling radio broadcasts about court cases that the librarians played for the retirees who shuffled in to read the papers. She wasn't rich. Her paycheck barely covered the rent and a few groceries. But she had something money couldn't buy: a brilliant mind. Alana was a legal genius, though no one in town knew it. She'd never set foot in a law school. There was no cash for that, and back then, who'd take a poor black girl from nowhere, Tennessee, seriously? But she taught herself. Oh, how she taught herself. Every law book she could borrow from the library, every faded newspaper with court reports. She devoured them all. She knew the Constitution better than some big city lawyers and could recite case law that even judges had long forgotten. That sunny May morning, Alana wasn't heading to the courthouse as a defendant or a witness. She was just a spectator. Her friend Mary had begged her to come along to a hearing, a minor parking ticket dispute, nothing fancy. Mary was a nervous sort, a plump woman with a soft voice who'd gotten a $50 fine for leaving her beat-up old Ford parked 5 minutes too long on Main Street. "I was just helping Mrs. Carter with her groceries," Mary had explained, wringing her hands. "I didn't mean no harm." Alana agreed to go, partly to support her friend and partly because she loved watching court proceedings. It was her little secret hobby, a way to feel connected to a world that seemed so far out of reach. She put on her best gray suit, one she'd sewn herself from a pattern she found in a thrift store magazine, adjusted the cross around her neck, and took a seat in the back row of the courtroom, clutching a worn notebook where she jotted down her thoughts. Then Judge Edwin Crawford strode in, and the air shifted. At over 70, he was a towering figure in Collinsville, literally and figuratively. Tall and gaunt, with a shock of white hair and a hawk-like stare, he'd been ruling the local court for 40 years. Folks respected him, feared him, and whispered about him all at once. He was known for his iron fist. He'd once fined old Mrs. Jenkins $10 for bringing knitting needles into the courtroom, calling them potential weapons. Another time, he'd made a teenager sweep the courthouse steps for chewing gum too loudly during a hearing. People joked he'd fine the sun for shining too bright if he could get away with it. To Crawford, the courtroom was his kingdom, and he was the king. Mary's hearing started off dull. She stammered through her explanation about the parking ticket, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ceiling fan. Judge Crawford wasn't in the mood for mercy. He banged his gavel and barked, $50, payable by the end of the week. Next case. Mary shrank in her seat, tears welling up. Alana watched silently, her fingers tightening around her pencil. She knew the judge was being harsh. The law allowed for leniency in cases like this, but she wasn't there to interfere. Not yet. Then everything changed. As Crawford scanned the room, his sharp eyes landed on Alana. The sunlight streaming through the window caught the glint of her tiny gold cross, and his face twisted like he'd tasted something sour. You in the back row, he snapped, jabbing a bony finger in her direction. What's that around your neck? Alana looked up, calm but slightly surprised. It's my cross, Your Honor, she said, her voice soft yet steady. There's no place for religious symbols in my courtroom, Crawford shot back, his tone icy. It's a violation of decorum. Take it off right now, or I'll fine you for contempt. The room went still. Everyone knew Crawford loved his rules, but this was a new one. Even the court clerk, Mrs. Grace, a gray-haired woman who'd worked with him for 2 decades, raised an eyebrow. Mary turned to Alana, her face a mask of panic. But Alana didn't flinch. She rose slowly, standing tall, her gaze locked on the judge. With all due respect, Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and unshaken, I have the right to wear this cross. The First Amendment of the Constitution guarantees my freedom of religion. You can't fine me for that. Crawford's face turned beet red. In 40 years, no one had dared challenge him in his own courtroom, and certainly not with the Constitution. You're not a lawyer, ma'am, he growled, leaning forward. You're a spectator, and I decide what's allowed here. $100 for contempt. Take off that cross or get out. Whispers rippled through the room. Alana stood her ground, her eyes flashing with something, not anger but determination. She knew he was wrong. She knew the law was on her side. And in that moment, a memory flickered. Grandma Ruth's voice, weathered but strong, saying, Justice don't come knocking, Alana. Sometimes you gotta demand it. She made her choice. I won't take it off, she said, her voice rising just enough to carry. And I'm contesting your fine, Your Honor. Right here, right now. The courtroom erupted in hushed gasps. Judge Crawford looked like he'd been slapped. Who was this woman, this nobody, daring to defy him? He had no idea that Alana Merriweather wasn't just a janitor with a cross around her neck. She was a legal genius, ready to turn his world upside down. Judge Crawford's gavel hovered in the air, his hands trembling with barely contained fury. You're contesting me? He sputtered, his voice rising to a pitch that made the old wooden benches creak under the weight of the tension. Young lady, you have no standing here. You're not a party to any case. Sit down before I have you removed. But Alana didn't sit. She took a step forward, her worn notebook still in hand, her gray suit crisp against the faded backdrop of the courtroom. Your Honor, she said, her tone steady as a rock, by fining me for wearing this cross, you've made me a party to this proceeding. You've imposed a penalty, and under Tennessee law, I have the right to challenge it. Article 1, Section 17 of the state constitution says every person has access to the courts for remedy of injury. I'm exercising that right. The room was so quiet you could hear the tick of the clock above the judge's bench. Mrs. Grace, the clerk, stopped typing, her fingers frozen over the keys. The handful of townsfolk in the gallery, farmers, retirees, a few curious old ladies with their Sunday hats still on, leaned forward, eyes wide. Even Mary, still sniffling from her own fine, forgot her tears and stared at her friend in awe. Crawford blinked, caught off guard, but he recovered fast. Don't quote law at me, he snapped. I've been a judge longer than you've been alive. You think you can waltz in here and play lawyer? I don't think I'm playing anything, Your Honor, Alana replied, her voice gaining strength. I'm stating facts. The First Amendment protects my right to express my faith. In 1969, the Supreme Court ruled in Tinker v. Des Moines that symbolic expression is protected speech, so long as it doesn't disrupt proceedings. My cross isn't disrupting anything, unless you're saying a piece of jewelry rattles your courtroom more than your own temper. A gasp rippled through the gallery. One old man in a plaid shirt let out a low whistle, quickly stifled by his wife's elbow. Crawford's face went from red to purple, his thin lips twitching. "You're out of line," he roared. "This isn't some fancy Supreme Court case. This is my courtroom, and I say that crosses a distraction. $200 now. Keep talking, and it'll be more." Alana didn't flinch. She opened her notebook, flipping to a page covered in her neat, tiny handwriting. "If it's your courtroom, Your Honor, then you know the law applies even here. In Church of Lukumi Babalu Aya versus City of Hialeah, 1993, the Supreme Court struck down a restriction on religious practice because it wasn't neutral or generally applicable. Your rule against my cross isn't in any posted court policy. I checked. It's your personal preference, and that doesn't hold up. You're violating my rights, and I can prove it." Crawford slammed his gavel so hard the handle cracked. "Enough! You're not a lawyer, and I won't have this nonsense. Bailiff, escort her out." The bailiff, a burly man named Tom, who'd known Alana since she was a kid, hesitated. He glanced at her, then at the judge, shifting his weight awkwardly. "Now, Tom," Crawford barked. But before Tom could move, Alana spoke again, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "If you remove me, Your Honor, you'll have to explain it to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. I'll file a writ of mandamus claiming abuse of judicial discretion. You're fining me without due process. No hearing, no evidence, just your say-so. That's a violation of the 5th and 14th Amendments. You want to test that in a higher court?" The word appeals hung in the air like a thunderclap. Crawford froze, his gavel still raised. He'd built his career on being untouchable in Collinsville. But the threat of a federal court review was a different beast. He wasn't some big-shot judge with a team of clerks to back him up. He was a small-town ruler who'd never had his authority questioned like this. The gallery buzzed with whispers. "She said appeals court," one woman muttered. "She's gonna take him down," hissed another. Crawford lowered his gavel, his eyes narrowing. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice wavered just enough to betray him. "You're a janitor, not a legal scholar. Where'd you learn all this?" Alana smiled, a small, quiet smile that held a world of confidence. "I learned it from books, Your Honor, the same books you swore to uphold when you took your oath. I may mop floors for a living, but I know my rights, and I know yours don't include punishing me for my faith." For the first time in 40 years, Judge Crawford didn't know what to say. He stared at her, this woman he'd dismissed as a nobody, and saw something he hadn't expected, a mind sharper than his own. The bailiff still hadn't moved. Mrs. Grace's mouth hung open, her glasses slipping down her nose. Mary clutched her purse, whispering, "Lord have mercy," under her breath. Crawford leaned back in his chair, trying to regain control. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "You want to play this game? Fine. We'll have a hearing on your fine. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp. Bring your so-called evidence. But I'm warning you, Missy, you're digging your own grave." Alana nodded, closing her notebook. "I'll be here, Your Honor, and I'll bring more than evidence. I'll bring the truth." As she turned to leave, the gallery erupted in murmurs. Old Mr. Jenkins, the one whose wife had been fined for knitting needles, clapped his hands and chuckled. "That girl's got fire," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. His wife shushed him, but she was smiling too. Mary rushed after Alana, grabbing her arm. "What in heaven's name are you doing?" she whispered. "You can't fight a judge." "I'm not fighting him," Alana said, her eyes fixed on the door. "I'm fighting for what's right. He picked the wrong day to mess with me." Outside, the sun was still high, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Alana paused, touching the cross at her neck. She thought of Grandma Ruth again, not just her words about justice, but the way she'd sit on the porch at night, humming hymns and telling stories of David and Goliath. "The little guy can win," Ruth used to say, "if he's got God and a good head on his shoulders." Alana had both, and she wasn't backing down. Back in the courtroom, Crawford sat alone at his bench, staring at the cracked gavel. He'd underestimated her. That much was clear. But he wasn't about to let some upstart janitor make a fool of him. He'd spent decades building his reputation, and he'd crush her at that hearing, law or no law. Or so he thought. Here's the third and final part of your YouTube video script for Judge finds Black woman for wearing a cross, only to discover she's a legal genius. It flows seamlessly from the second part, as requested, and brings the story to a satisfying conclusion for your 60-plus American audience. This part wraps up the narrative with Alana's triumph and a reflective ending, staying within the planned 50,000 character total across all three parts. The next morning, the Collinsville courthouse was packed tighter than a sardine can. Word had spread like wildfire through the town. Alana Merriweather, the quiet janitor with the gold cross, was taking on Judge Crawford. Folks who hadn't set foot in the courtroom in years showed up, clutching thermoses of coffee and whispering excitedly. Old Mr. Jenkins brought his wife, who'd knitted a tiny scarf overnight just to spite the judge. Mary sat in the front row, twisting her hands, her faith in Alana warring with her nerves. Even the local paper sent a stringer, a young kid with a notepad, scribbling furiously as the clock ticked toward 9 a.m. Alana walked in right on time, her gray suit pressed, her cross gleaming against her chest. She carried her notebook and a stack of library books, borrowed late the night before, their spines cracked and pages dog-eared. She didn't look nervous. She looked ready. Crawford was already at the bench, his face a mask of grim determination. His cracked gavel had been replaced with a shiny new one, as if that could restore his shaken authority. "Let's get this over with," he growled as Alana took her place at the defendant's table. "You've got 5 minutes to explain why I shouldn't fine you double for wasting my time." Alana didn't waste a second. "Your Honor," she began, her voice ringing clear, "yesterday you fined me for wearing this cross, claiming it violated courtroom decorum. I'm here to prove that fine is unlawful. First, the First Amendment protects my right to religious expression. In West Virginia's State Board of Education v. Barnett, 1943, the Supreme Court ruled that no one can be forced to abandon a symbol of their belief unless it poses a clear and present danger. My cross isn't a weapon or a disruption. It's a quiet statement of faith." Crawford snorted, but Alana pressed on. "Second, your order lacks legal grounding. I reviewed the Collinsville court rules, all 10 pages of them, and there's no ban on religious symbols. In Reed v. Town of Gilbert, 2015, the Supreme Court said restrictions on expression must be content neutral. Your rule targets my cross because it's religious, not because it's jewelry. That's discrimination, plain and simple." She opened one of her books, sliding it across the table with a highlighted passage. "Third, you denied me due process. The Fifth Amendment says no one can be deprived of property, my money, without a fair hearing. You fined me on the spot, no notice, no chance to defend myself. In Matthews v. Eldridge, 1976, the court laid out the test for due process, and your actions fail it. I'm not a lawyer, Your Honor, but I don't need a degree to know the Constitution." The gallery buzzed. Mr. Jenkins nodded like he was at a sermon, muttering, "Amen to that." Crawford gripped his gavel, his knuckles white. "This is a circus," he snapped. "You're twisting the law to fit your story. I've run this court for 40 years. I know what's proper." "Then you should know better," Alana shot back, her calm cracking just enough to show the fire beneath. "You're not above the law, Your Honor. You swore an oath to uphold it, same as me when I swore to tell the truth here today. If you can fine me for my cross, what's next? Banning Bibles? Rosaries? You're not protecting order. You're flexing power." Crawford banged his gavel. "That's enough. I've heard your little speech. The fine stands. $200 payable now, or you're in contempt again." But Alana wasn't done. She pulled out her ace. "If you insist, Your Honor, I'll pay it, under protest, and then I'll file a federal lawsuit under 42 U.S.C., Section 1983 for violation of my civil rights. I've got the forms ready, courtesy of the library's copy machine. I'll name you personally, not just the court. The Sixth Circuit doesn't take kindly to judges who trample the Constitution. Look up Harlow v. Fitzgerald, 1982, if you doubt me. Qualified immunity won't save you when the law's this clear." The room went dead silent. Crawford's eyes widened, his bravado crumbling. A federal lawsuit? In his town? He'd heard whispers of judges hauled before appeals courts, their careers ruined over less. He glanced at the gallery, at the faces of people he'd ruled over for decades, now watching him squirm. Mrs. Grace coughed, breaking the spell, and the young reporter scribbled so fast his pencil nearly snapped. Crawford leaned back, his voice low. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" "As serious as the oath you took," Alana said, meeting his gaze. "Drop the fine, Your Honor. It's the right thing to do." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then with a grunt, he waved his hand. "Fine withdrawn. Case dismissed. Get out of my courtroom." The gallery erupted. Mr. Jenkins whooped, his wife clapping her hands. Mary jumped up, hugging Alana so hard she nearly dropped her books. "You did it!" she cried. Alana just smiled, tucking her cross under her collar. "I had to," she said softly, "for Grandma Ruth." As the crowd spilled outside, the story took on a life of its own. By noon, Marge's diner was abuzz with talk of the janitor who beat the judge. The reporter's article hit the paper the next day, headlined "Cross of Justice, Local Woman Schools Judge in Courtroom Showdown." People started calling Alana a hero, though she brushed it off. "I'm no hero," she told Mary over coffee. "I just know what's mine to keep." Weeks later, a letter arrived from a law firm in Nashville. They'd read the story and offered to pay for Alana to take the bar exam. No school required, just her raw talent. She stared at it, fingers tracing her cross, and thought of Ruth's porch hymns. Maybe the little guy could win after all. Back at the courthouse, Crawford retired quietly that fall. Some said he couldn't face the whispers. Others said he'd met his match. His new gavel sat unused, a relic of a reign that ended with a woman who wouldn't back down. And in Collinsville, whenever folks passed the library, they'd nod toward it, knowing a genius had swept its floors and swept away injustice too.